So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Workforce Wednesday webinar. Thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate it. We hope you all had a wonderful holiday last week. And we are back to work this week, doing what we're all so passionate about. So we're excited that you have joined us this morning for our PD session on the Digital Equity Act. We're going to be talking about new federal funding and what that really means for WIOA partners. We are joined by Amanda from the National Skills Coalition, and I'll let her introduce herself in a second here. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. My name is Kirsten Bayer, and I am with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, and we are housed at Illinois State University. I will be on this session for technical support, and anything regarding the session that you need support on, feel free to reach out to me via the chat, which I will make sure that everybody can chat with everybody here. So you can feel free to type in the chat, say good morning or anything this morning, and introduce yourself to everybody who's on the webinar this morning with us. Another housekeeping item is that we do have live closed captioning on for accessibility reasons, or even if you just like to take notes. We will be putting the PDF version of the slide deck in the chat. I'll put that in there momentarily here once Amanda gets started. And then it will also be on our website, the Illinois Workforce Academy website, which I'll put a link for that in the chat as well. But it will be up there and on Illinois WorkNet within about 48 hours after video editing. And we'll get that out to everybody. Tomorrow, you'll also receive a follow-up email that will have a follow-up survey in it, along with all of those URLs where the recording will be housed and the presentation slide deck can be found as well. So this session is going to be recorded. As always, we will have it up on our Illinois Workforce website and on our also on Illinois WorkNet as well. So before we hand things off to Amanda, we're going to do our beginning polls. So we would just like to kind of gauge our audience this morning. I've gone ahead and launched that. Which partner do you best represent? If you are joining us from Title 1, 2, 3, or 4, or if you best represent another WIOA partner, stakeholder, or a state or local workforce innovation board member. We just like to know this for our analytical purposes, helps us with reporting, and helps us kind of gauge our audience so we can know what topics to pick. Everybody is saying good morning in the chat and happy Wednesday. Yes, happy Wednesday. Thank you all for participating. We'll give it a couple more seconds for this poll. And then I'm going to go ahead and end that and share the results. So looks like everybody, a lot of people are joining us from Title 1, 55%, and then a couple of people from Title 2 as well. Always awesome to see Title 3 people too. Welcome. And we have a couple other WIOA partners and stakeholders as well. So thank you so much for joining us this morning, everyone. We really appreciate it. Last poll question really quickly is just where you're joining us from this morning. So where's your local area? I'm joining you from Central Illinois. Our center is located in Bloomington Normal on Illinois State University's campus. So that's where I'm joining you from this morning. Amanda, where are you joining us from? Up north, right?
I am based in Philadelphia, actually. So on the East Coast.
So it's a little earlier than this for you there. Right?
It's actually a little later. It's 11 o'clock in the morning here in Philadelphia.
Nice. Okay, we'll give everyone. All right. I went ahead and ended that poll, and then looks like we did have one person who's joining us from out of state as well. So they're right along there with you, Amanda. And then we have everybody else sprinkled across the state. So thank you for joining us and answering those polls. We always appreciate your participation. I'm going to hand it off to Amanda to get us started with the presentation today, and then I will be here via the chat, and I'll put all those resources, URLs, and the PDF slides in the chat here momentarily. So take it away, Amanda.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today. So I have a set of slides that I'm going to talk through. Please feel free to drop your questions into the chat as we go. If it's a quick question, I may pause to answer it. Otherwise, we're going to have pretty ample time for Q&A at the end. So please do feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we go. Or if you want to use the Q&A function, you can do that too. Okay, so first of all, who am I and who is my organization? The goal for today's conversation, we'll get into that in a minute, but I'm Amanda Bergson-Chilcock. I am a senior fellow at National Skills Coalition. We are a Big Tent bipartisan coalition of workforce, adult education, and higher education advocates. And I'll tell you a little bit more about us in a minute. For today's conversation, my goal is when you sign off today, you'll have an understanding of the Digital Equity Act legislation that passed Congress last year and how it relates to the WIOA system. You'll know a bit more about how you can get engaged in state digital equity planning and start preparing to apply for some of this new funding. And you can find out some more about the employer demand for digital skills, workers' current digital skill levels, and best practices in digital upskilling. So it's a lot of material, but hopefully it'll be very connected to your daily work. And so hopefully easy to make those connections in your minds as you're hearing the new material. So National Skills Coalition is a 20-year-old nonprofit. We are foundation funded and funded through private donations so we can stay independent in making our policy recommendations to government. We advocate for good state and federal policies that provide high quality workforce training so that more people have access to a better life and more local businesses see sustained growth. We have some specific goals around digital equity. And if this is something that you are on board with, we invite you to sign on to our Digital Equity at Work principles. You can do that as an individual. You don't have to do it on behalf of your organization. And signing on to our principles does not obligate you to any legislative position or any lobbying. It just says that you agree that these principles are important, and it will make sure that you're added to our email list for future updates. So the pandemic really brought home to everyone something that had become increasingly clear, which is everyone needs digital skills. And that's true across occupations. So I've put a list here. My guess is if you polled your WIOA participants, many of them would have experience with these in their jobs today, right? So construction workers who are using mobile apps to submit a work order change on a building job, home health aides who are using tablet computers to enter patient information or vital signs, truck drivers who have to submit their payroll records so they can get paid, manufacturing workers working with cobots, which are collaborative robots, point of sale systems in retail, logistics software in warehousing industry. These digital skill demands have grown enormously in the past few years, and particularly since the pandemic. And we have some cool new research coming out, which I'll share at the end of today's presentation, that really affirms that even for workers with only a high school diploma or an associate degree, and even for workers with 0 to 2 years of experience, digital skills are overwhelmingly required by employers. So this is a widespread challenge, right? But until recently, federal workforce policy was really lagging behind, right? Digital literacy was an allowable activity that was kind of buried 3 layers deep in Title II of WIOA, and it really was not called out as a focus area under WIOA. The infrastructure law that passed last November, which is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, for the first time changed that by including the Digital Equity Act, which is almost $3 billion nationally that will support broadband access, digital devices, and digital skills for a huge range of American workers and even folks who are not in the workforce. If you're the kind of person that likes to geek out and read the legislation, I've included a link here. That's the orange link in the slide. So when you get the PDF of the slides that Kirsten is dropping in the chat, and then you'll get via email, when you get the recording of today's session, you can read the full legislative text. It'll open up with a full 1,100-page Infrastructure Act, but if you just do a find for Digital Equity Act, it's only about 6 or 7 pages long, and it's pretty easy reading. In addition to the Digital Equity Act, IIJA also includes $42 billion for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, or BEAD. And I'm going to talk briefly about that because there are some implications for the workforce system, but just to let you know that there's a much bigger pot of money under BEAD that will also be coming to Illinois. Obviously, those numbers are national, and Illinois will be getting numbers based in part on your state's population. So what is the approximate timeline, right? So when we think about, okay, what money is coming and what do we need to do to prepare for it? Right now, states are beginning their year-long digital equity planning process, which is required by the law. Next year, the federal agency that oversees this funding will release their Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, for the states for formula funding, right? So every state will automatically get formula funding, and then the states will re-grant that down to the local level. There will also be a separate NOFO that is coming directly from the federal government for competitive grants that states and other eligible entities can apply for. I'm going to talk through each of these in a bit more detail so you know what money is coming, when it's coming, who's eligible, and how it relates to the WIOA system. But I wanted you to have this approximate timeline here just so that it was something you could refer back to. So, oops, there we go. Your state is just about to receive its Digital Equity Act and BEAD planning grants. And when I say just about to receive, what I mean is in the last couple of weeks, 9 states have gotten their grants. Illinois will get theirs certainly in the next month or so, I think, and then get going on developing its state digital equity plan. So this is the map, and the darker orange shows which states have already received their planning grants. There's not really rhyme or reason at this point to who's gotten their planning grant and who hasn't. If you want to check on this, the URL for this map is in the bottom left corner of the slide, so you can just go to that website and visit it. That website also has some additional information, and I've pulled out. There's a couple of contact people that are listed for Illinois. One is someone who works for the federal government, and that's the person who's overseeing the BEAD and digital equity funding. And that person is the federal program officer. And then the second person is the state broadband officer for Illinois, who your governor put in as the main point of contact, right? So again, that's the federal government's website. You're welcome to bookmark that and go back to check on it if you want to see developments. Once Illinois gets its grants, there'll be an update there about how much money Illinois has received, and there'll be updated timelines. Okay, so why does this planning period matter, right? The reason these plans matter, they are not just plans that are going to go sit on a shelf when they are done. Creating the 5-year digital equity plan will be the backbone for how the formula funding, which is $1.44 billion nationwide, is spent over the next 5 years. And similarly, the BEAD plans will be setting the parameters for the next 5 years of broadband spending, some of which will be things like, actually laying the fiber to create broadband connections. But in many places will also include investment in broadband workforce development, right? So workforce programs, training broadband tower technicians or fiber optic technicians, that kind of thing. So the reason the planning period matters is because what's written in the plans will shape the money that gets spent in the next 5 years. And every state's digital equity plan must show how they will close equity gaps for covered populations. Here's the list of covered populations. I know, based on the poll that Kirsten did for you all this morning, that all of you are WIOA system partners, right? So there is phenomenal overlap between the covered populations under the Digital Equity Act and the kinds of folks who are walking in the doors of the workforce centers and adult education programs that are funded in the WIOA system, right? So folks who are low income, below 150% of poverty, aging individuals over the age of 60, veterans, folks with disabilities, English learners, folks with limited literacy, people of color, rural residents. And then I know some of you may run corrections education programs, incarcerated individuals, as long as they're incarcerated in a state or local facility, not a federal facility, right? So these are the covered populations that Illinois will have to explain how they are serving in its digital equity plan. And again, when we talk about digital equity, we're kind of talking about three legs of a stool. Do people have broadband access? Do people have a digital device? And most importantly, for our purposes, do they have the digital skills to be able to do what they want to do job-wise and otherwise, right? Some of you may already be engaged in pre-planning with your state agency peers in Illinois. And if that's the case, I want to make sure that you have a copy of the recommendations that we put out this summer, which are linked on the slide here. If you click on the image, when you get the PDFs, you'll be able to access the recommendations. If you're not already at the planning table, but you'd like to be, I'm going to invite you to think today about what kind of data or expertise or relationships you have that can help you get a seat at the table. And we'll talk more about that in the Q&A. I'm happy to kind of go deeper on this, but this is really just kind of a bookmark to come back to. So once your state completes its digital equity plan, then the formula funding will come. And the formula funding will come to your state's administering entity, which in Illinois may be your state broadband office. I believe that was the person's contact name that the feds put on the website. So I'm assuming that's the case, but that's certainly something to double check. And then there will be a process by which your state will re-grant that money down to local partners. We don't know yet how any state, including Illinois, will manage this process. Some states might just do an open request for proposals. Some states might choose to push some of that money out through existing networks of service providers. We don't know for sure. And this is another reason why it's really important to be involved in the state digital equity planning process to help shape how this formula money will trickle down to the local level. So in addition to that formula funding that'll get re-granted, there's also the ability to apply directly to the federal government for what the feds sometimes call a discretionary grant or a competitive grant. So there's a long list of people and organizations that are eligible to apply directly to the federal government for these grants. Any local government or state government agency is eligible to apply unless they are the state agency that's overseeing the formula funding. So you don't get two bites of the apple. If you're already overseeing the formula funding as the state agency, you don't also get to apply for a competitive grant, but everybody else can, right? So if you're representing a local government agency, you would absolutely be eligible. Any nonprofit organization that is not a K-12 school is eligible to apply. Let me say that again. Any nonprofit organization that is not a K-12 school is eligible to apply. Community anchor institutions, this is defined in the law, but one of the key organizations that's represented in the community anchor institution is community colleges. So I know some of you may be partnering with community colleges, any local education agency, right? Some of you are Title II partners, you might be working with local education agencies, and any entity that carries out a workforce development program. So this is a big, expansive list. My guess is that everybody listening today is going to be eligible to apply based on the organizations that you work for today. If you think that your organization is not eligible, please talk to me offline or during the Q&A. My guess is you probably are eligible. Now, one of the reasons this matters is that doing a federal grant is kind of a heavy lift, right? There's a lot of paperwork associated. You have to have financials tracked in a certain way. You have to have certain kinds of audits. You may decide that that's more of a headache than you want to deal with. So you have a whole year to kind of get your ducks in a row and figure out if some other organization might want to be the lead applicant and you might want to be a subcontractor on a federal grant application, right? So, but this is the long list of all the entities that can apply directly to the feds. If you get one of these federal competitive grants, you have to engage in at least one of these activities. And I'm going to leave this slide up here for a minute because there's a lot to it. And I see that there's a question in the chat about whether the competitive grant will be over a 5-year time frame. And the answer is we don't know yet. It is possible that the feds will give a 1 5-year grant. It is possible that they might give 1 3-year grant with additional rounds of money in the future. We don't know that for sure. My guess from a sort of housekeeping perspective is they're not going to want to run lots of different grant competitions, but I don't know that for sure. That's just a guess. And we'll know more as the time gets closer and the feds start to put out additional information. So if you receive one of these federal competitive grants, you have to carry out at least one of these activities. And the one I want to emphasize for us for workforce purposes is the third one, which I've highlighted in green. Training programs rather, for covered populations that cover basic, advanced, and applied skills or other workforce development programs. Now, you remember that list of covered populations that we just looked at, right? Folks who are people of color, low income, veterans, et cetera, et cetera. These are all the folks that are already walking through the doors of our WIOA programs, right? So it's a slam dunk for you to be able to talk about why your program can reach the covered populations that this law envisions. You also want to be able, though, to connect the dots to the digital skills that you're helping people learn. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But we know, and you know, probably not only because of your participants, but perhaps because of your staff, right? I know I've heard a lot of stories from workforce centers and adult education programs that when the pandemic hit, they were kind of having a startle moment about their own staff. Some people didn't have home high-speed internet connections. Some people didn't have a laptop at home. Some staff members didn't have the digital skills they needed to be able to conduct virtual services or virtual classes, right? So you can put forth a federal grant application that says that you are going to help people get access to broadband and devices, as well as building digital skills, right? And so you might want to design a kind of holistic program that's going to support doing all of those things. Or you might want to, again, this goes back to the partner question, right? You might have a lead agency who's going to lead on the broadband and devices piece, and you're going to lead on the workforce training piece, because that's what you know, and that's where your organization's expertise is. So those are the major pots of federal money and the rough timeline that they're coming from. The federal law does define some really key terms that are really helpful. And I've put those formal definitions. These are drawn directly from the law. These are verbatim definitions. What is digital inclusion? What is digital literacy? And in this conversation, I am using digital skills and digital literacy interchangeably. The federal law refers typically to digital literacy, but I often talk about digital skills. So that's a quick overview of what the legislation says and what money is coming. I want to center us now on the people who are walking through the doors of your workforce centers and participating in your adult education classes, the people that you're serving through Title II or III or IV programs, helping with job search, helping obtain individual training account dollars or vouchers to go pursue training at an eligible training provider. These are the folks that you're already serving, and in many cases, they are the folks that the law envisions you would serve under the Digital Equity Act. And we know that some of you are already teaching digital skills, right? either as a component of another class, perhaps a resume class or a particular job prep class, or perhaps as part of an adult education program, right? So I want to get specific here. People need both foundational digital skills and industry-specific skills. Across the country, workforce and adult education partners have been much stronger at teaching the foundational skills, and in many cases are much earlier or have not even yet started to teach industry-specific or occupational skills. And that's a problem, right? Your job seekers need opportunities not just to learn very basic, oh, can I send an email? Can I use a mouse? Can I install a new app on my phone, right? They need the ability to do the kinds of industry-specific digital skills that almost every employer is going to be requiring of them. So I'm going to go back for just a sec to that list of things that you can do using that federal funding, right? Training programs that cover basic, advanced, and applied skills. So my hope is you've got a whole year to plan here. My hope is that if you're already teaching foundational or basic digital skills to workforce-centered clients, that you'll think now about the next level of industry-specific or occupational digital skills. And I'll give some examples of what that can look like in just a moment here. Okay, so let's set a quick foundation first. We know that basic computer skills are in very high demand. We have a big new study coming out from National Skills Coalition that'll be out in January. And across more than 15,000 skills requested by employers in online job ads last year, basic computer literacy was number 13 out of all those skills. So it placed really high in terms of the demand among employers, right? And the data set we used was 43 million help wanted ads posted online during calendar year 2021 from, some of you may know the company that used to be known as Burning Glass or MZ is now Lightcast. So that was the data source that we used. But we know that a lot of workers don't have those foundational digital skills. This is from earlier research that was conducted by National Skills Coalition using a US data set of workers aged 16 to 64. 31% of US workers who are currently employed have few or no foundational digital skills. And yet, many workers who lack digital literacy have jobs that require them to use computers. So on the left-hand side, you see workers with no digital skills. On the right-hand side, you see workers with limited digital skills. And in both cases, that bright green portion of the chart shows the percentage of folks who need moderate or complex computer skills for their current job. So you might say to me, Amanda, how does this work? First, you tell me that 13% of workers have no digital skills, 18% have very few digital skills, and then you tell me that among those people with few or no digital skills, they still are working in jobs that require them to use computers. And the answer is that people spend a huge amount of time covering for and compensating for their skill gaps. You may know from those of you in the adult ed world, right? How do people cover for their reading skill gaps? They say, I left my glasses at home, or they say, I'm going to take this home to read tonight. And what they really mean is, I'm going to have a child or a spouse help me figure this out, right? Same thing with digital skills, right? People will say they'll take work home at night. They'll take a picture of something with their smartphone. They'll go home and have a family member help them figure it out. They'll lean on their supervisors or their coworkers, right? So we call this an invisible drag on productivity. And I heard so many stories about this when I did qualitative interviews for the study that we're working on now. I talked to one trucking company that had shifted their truckers over to payroll software that was submitted via their smartphones. And they only realized after they made the switch over that their supervisors were spending a huge amount of time on the phone with their truck drivers, helping them figure out how to install this software on their phones, how to create a login using two-factor authentication, how to make sure that their hours in payroll were logged correctly so that they could get paid on time. And so they kind of jumped the gun on adopting this technology in the workplace, assuming that, oh, well, everyone has a smartphone, everyone must know how to do computer skills. But the reality is that folks often have fragmented knowledge. And we'll talk about what fragmented knowledge is in just a moment. I heard another story from an organization that talked about how construction workers and their company, they're a big specialty construction company, 5 years ago, most of their general contractors that they were subbing for were using paper to manage a lot of their processes. But now they use blueprint technology apps. So if you're a construction worker on the job, you're the plumber, you're the electrician, whoever you are, and you see a problem, you need to snap a picture with your phone and then use the blueprint technology app to submit an RFI, a request for information, to the general contractor to say, hey, this isn't up to code, or I can't do my plumbing work until the electrician finishes her work over here, right? Frontline construction workers, the person I interviewed, they have folks on job sites all over a big state, some rural areas, some urban. Many of their construction workers don't speak English as a first language. And they realize that their workers need to have these technology skills in order to make sure that their company can stay in conversation with the general contractors who are their bread and butter, right? So again, a lot of folks need digital skills on the job. A lot of folks are spending time and energy trying to keep their heads above water in a difficult environment where they're trying to use digital skills despite not being comfortable, right? Fragmented knowledge is when you're comfortable with some tasks, you're not comfortable with others, right? So maybe you're comfortable texting a photo or making a TikTok video, but you're not comfortable creating a spreadsheet, right? And so a key role for the workforce and adult education system is, how do we help workers build bridges between the skills they have and the skills they need, without assuming that they don't have any skills, right? Digital skills are not binary, right? It's not that you either have them all or you don't have any. Most people are somewhere in between. And so what we want to create as far as workforce development programs are opportunities for people to build on those skills they already have and acquire the skills that they need. Probably this next information that I'm going to share with you is pretty common sense, but hopefully it will affirm to you things that you've already been working on or thinking about. People prefer to learn digital skills in a real world context, right? They're most motivated to build skills when they see a clear connection to their aspirations. So if they walk in the door of a workforce center and they say, I want to get a job, or I want to get a better job, or they walk in the door of an adult education program and they say, I want to get promoted at my job, or I want to help my children with homework, right? Those are their aspirations. And connecting their aspirations to the skills you're helping them build is really powerful, right? And people need to build digital resilience and a sense of self-efficacy, right? So digital resilience is not just, oh, did I memorize one particular software program? It's, oh, if I'm confronted with a novel software program, do I feel comfortable experimenting and figuring it out, right? In the 7 years that I've worked at my job, we've had 3 different kinds of expense reporting software, right? And I haven't had formal training on any of them. So that's the kind of thing that many workers are going to be confronted with, right? Here's a new piece of software. We expect you to figure out how to use it. So building that sense of digital resilience is really important. And a sense of self-efficacy, right? I can do this. It's not just confidence. It's a sense that the person is capable, that they have done hard things before, they can do hard things again. And that really gets to the design of workforce development programs. Teaching digital skills requires expertise, right? This is not something where it's like, well, I've used a computer, I can certainly teach computer skills. So we see now that professional development is incredibly important. And some of you may know the Workforce Professionals Training Institute in New York. They've had a whole year-long digital transformation initiative that they've been doing with Workforce Center and adult education staff to help the workforce and WIOA system staff get comfortable around digital skills to position them to better serve the job seekers and adult learners that they serve. People are social learners, right? We saw during the pandemic that some folks were like, oh, maybe if we just slap a link up on our website with a link to Coursera or LinkedIn Learning or Google Career Certificates, people will just follow that link and they'll learn independently. That works for a small minority of people. But for most of us, even if we're doing an online class, we need some kind of peer coaching, social support, interaction with an instructor, weekly meetings, some kind of ancillary support, right? And so again, for those of you who are in workforce systems, you may already be offering some online learning resources to your job seekers. The research says the more that can be paired with some kinds of ancillary support in the form of coaching, peer ambassadors, other kinds of resources, the more likely it is that people will actually use those online learning tools, and the more likely it is that they'll actually benefit from them. And then, of course, once people build those foundational skills, they need opportunities for upskilling with industry-specific skills to stay in their current jobs as those jobs transform, or to reskill if they get laid off and they need to move into a different occupation or industry. What do we know helps and works to build occupational digital skills? Pretty common sense, right? Contextualized and integrated learning, close partnerships between education and workforce providers and employers, rapid prototyping of new programs. And we have a whole report on this, which I've linked here in case folks want to go in more depth to what that looks like. We know that the employer feedback that you gather, whether it's through surveys or an employer advisory committee or your actual workforce board meeting, is really important in making sure that programs are targeting locally needed skills. I'm going to tell you a quick story from Nashville. Nashville Chamber of Commerce was hearing a bit from Google about the Google Career Certificates and trying to encourage folks to go earn those. And the chamber said, well, let's survey our members and see if employers in the Nashville area are really interested in workers who have the Google Career Certificate. And so they did a survey and they heard back from employers, well, these are the occupations for which we would be interested if somebody had earned a Google Career Certificate. But if they earn that certificate, make sure that they get the Python programming language add-on, right? That's what will make it really valuable. That kind of employer intelligence is absolutely vital, right? Because you can look at national statistics or even your state labor market information agencies, and that will give you broad brushstrokes information about what kinds of skills are in most demand. But employers are the ones, hiring managers are the ones who can tell you on the ground, yeah, this is what I'm hiring for. Yes, this credential means something to me. No, I've never heard of this credential. I'm not sure what I would think if I saw it on somebody's resume, right? Because the last thing we want to do is send job seekers or adult learners on a wild goose chase where they spend time earning a credential or building a skill that's not really in demand in your local economy. Your state labor market agency can be a valuable source of data on employer demand as well. And there are many opportunities with that Digital Equity Act funding that I was talking about before to braid that with your WIOA funding and help workers build more digital skills. I would be remiss if I didn't emphasize that structural racism affects every aspect of inequities in digital skills, right? If you grow up in a neighborhood that doesn't have broadband access or doesn't have affordable broadband access, if you went to a school district that was under-resourced and couldn't afford to let you use the computer lab more than once a week, or the computer lab had old, outdated devices, if you had limited opportunity in your family to have built wealth because of the racial wealth gap, and therefore you weren't able to afford a home computer, right? These are all structural factors that can make it harder for workers of color to build digital skills. And it's important when we're thinking about programs and skill building opportunities to recognize that this isn't about the individual failings of individual workers, right? It's not individual people's fault that structural problems exist. I'll give you a quick story from Chicago. So the executive director of the American Library Association has made public speeches on this topic. And a story that she often tells is at the beginning of the pandemic, when everyone was working from home, she was in her home on the south side of Chicago, trying to have Zoom meetings with her colleagues who lived in whiter northern suburbs of Chicago. But her internet connection kept dropping because in her neighborhood, her predominantly African-American neighborhood, and she herself is also African-American, there was not the quality of broadband access that was needed in order to sustain video chat conversations. So that's a structural problem, right? She's a highly educated woman who has a national job with a high-profile organization, and it didn't matter because her neighborhood was subject to inequities that were structural factors that had nothing to do with her personal level of education or her personal ability to afford a good broadband connection. And that happens over and over again in different contexts. Because public policies helped create those kinds of inequities, policies are also part of the solution, right? And so when we think about designing program models or funding applications for this Digital Equity Act funding, I hope you're also thinking about the ways in which workers of color can be, those structural barriers can be tackled so that people are on equal playing fields and equal footing with their white or higher income or other counterparts. And we know that data can help you understand equity gaps and implement policies to address those kinds of equity gaps. And again, happy to chat more about this in the Q&A. So the last thing I want to do before we pause for some more questions is to share with you a sneak peek at some really cool new data that we have coming out. I mentioned that in January, we have a new study. We looked at 43 million help wanted ads from across the country in the calendar year 2021. 47% of all job postings require people to have at least one digital skill, and 91% require a digital or likely digital skill. What do we mean by likely or potentially digital? Well, a definitely digital skill is something like Microsoft Office or Epic electronic health record software or programmable logic control PLC programming language, right? A likely digital skill is something like making travel arrangements, right? You could theoretically pick up the phone, call a travel agent, and make your travel arrangements entirely over the phone. But in most cases these days, to make travel arrangements requires some computer skills because you're going to be going online, you're going to go to Expedia or Travelocity or some website or an airplane website, book tickets, navigate a website, all of those skills. This high demand for workers with digital skills still holds true even for workers with relatively less formal education and for workers with very limited experience in the workforce. It holds true even for job postings from smaller businesses that only post a few job ads per year. And we see a very clear stair step that the median hourly wage for a job that requires digital skills is significantly higher than for non-digital jobs, right? So it's about 23% higher. It's roughly $17 an hour is the median wage for jobs with no digital skills, and roughly $21 an hour for jobs that require even one digital skill. As the number of digital skills goes up, for example, jobs that require 3 or 5 or 7 different types of digital skills, the wages also go up. So this research will be out in January, and we'll be able to provide an Illinois-specific briefing if that's something that you'd like us to come back and do at that point. But I wanted to give you this kind of sneak peek at the forthcoming research to help inform your thinking about the WIOA system and job seekers and digital skills. So that's the end of my formal presentation. And what we have now is plenty of time for questions. I'd love to hear from you any questions you have about what I've just been talking about, but also if you are working on a cool program, or if you have been doing digital skills work in your adult education or workforce system, please share that in the chat. We'd love to hear about examples from the field and things that you all are working on. And I don't mean to imply that all this information is new to you. My guess is some of this is very familiar to you because you've been working on these issues for quite some time. So let's open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. So yeah, if you would like to type any questions in the chat or in the Q&A, me and Amanda can facilitate those.
Great. And while that's happening, I'm just going to scroll forward and show you the last couple of slides here. I put my contact information on a slide. I also linked, this is the full report that has all of the data on workers' current level of digital skills from a couple of years ago. So that's here. We also have a fact sheet called Applying a Racial Equity Lens to Digital Literacy. We have some specific fact sheets by industry. We have this longer report on how to teach occupational digital skills. And then there are some great resources from a federal research project that I am an advisor on, but I'm not running the project. And I've linked those here. Framework for digital skills learning, a digital skills library for educators with free curricula and learning tools, and a whole bunch of other really valuable resources. Okay, looks like we have some questions coming in. Thanks, Jennifer, for the comment in the chat that this was useful information to you. I'm excited to hear that. Megan asked if we could clarify the time frame for the competitive grant process. So the short answer is that will happen in early 2024. Let me go back to that slide just so that folks can see this. So what will happen is states have a year to do their digital equity plans. So that'll be fall 2022 to fall 2023. And then the state formula funding will come out in fall of 2023, late 2023. And then in early 2024, because this has to be done within 30 days of the formula funding starting to come out, the NOFO for the competitive grants will come out. So Congress has already told the federal agency, you have to get the NOFO for the competitive grants out very promptly after the formula funding comes out. So you've got a year basically to plan for your competitive grant application. This is why this is a perfect time to get your partnerships in place and start kind of forming that. So I see some great comments in the chat here. Thank you, Megan, for noting the North Star digital literacy platform that a lot of folks use. I'm going to put a link to that in the chat because that's something that folks might be interested in checking out. You can actually take the assessment for free by yourself on their website. And thanks, Megan, for dropping that in as well. That's the North Star one. I'm going to also move forward. I see Veronica's question are, what are good assessments of someone's general digital literacy capacity? I'm going to go forward all the way to the very last slide in this presentation, where I was talking about that federally funded project. And let me pull that up. Okay, so if you want to get a sense of different ways to measure digital skills, this second link here that says excellent synopsis of the various digital skills frameworks, I think that's a great starting point. I would read that short blog post and start there. If you want to dig a little deeper, you can look in the long landscape scan, which is linked at the bottom here, which is I think like 60 pages long, but you can search for digital skills assessment or measurement in the landscape scan and just read the couple of pages that relate to that. So that's where I would recommend starting. Let's see. I see a couple of other questions here. We've answered the question about the timeline. We have a question from April. I'd love to hear more about how organizations that aren't currently at the table in discussing how grants will be distributed can join the conversation. So the first thing I will say to you is make sure that you are in contact with your state broadband office. And let me go back to that slide here so that you can easily access that. Okay, so this is the federal website that I shared with you before. And the contact person that they list for Illinois is Matt Schmidt, your state broadband officer. I would reach out there first and ask if his office is overseeing the digital equity plan, or if not, he will certainly be able to tell you who is. So that's where I would start, because that's the publicly listed contact person. And I believe that has been pulled from your governor's application for the planning grant funds. So I'd start there. And then I see the question from Amanda Foster. Are there any details on what the funding can be spent on specifically? For example, will English learning software be included? So the only details we have on what the software, what the funding can be spent on is the language that I showed you earlier, and I'll pull that back up, of the kinds of activities. Let me pull that up here. Okay. The kinds of activities that can be done using the competitive grant funds. So to implement training programs for covered populations that cover basic, advanced, and applied skills and other workforce development programs. So it does not explicitly say, but remember that English language learners are called out as a covered population under the law. And states are going to have to explain how they're going to help English language learners close the equity gaps that they face with digital equity. I think it will be very easy to make an argument that a training program that helps people build English language skills via software can also help them build digital skills. But this is all the detail we currently have from the federal government. We'll have more in the months to come as they release they'll probably release a public request for comment before they release a NOFO, the notice of funding opportunity. So this is all the detail we currently have on this front. The slides are dropped into the chat already. I see we have a question in the chat about whether the slides will be available. The PDF should be in the chat already, but I'm going to ask Kirsten to actually drop it in again now, just to make sure that that is easily accessible for everyone. And then I see the question from Megan of what federal agency is managing this grant process. It's the Commerce Department, and it's the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA. And I've just put that in the chat so that you all can see that. Commerce does not know the WIOA system. They don't know the WIOA partners, right? This is not their area of expertise. So National Skills Coalition has been doing a lot of work with federal agency staff to kind of talk with them about the importance of the workforce system as partners in implementing the Digital Equity Act and the importance of the adult education partners. I'm going to drop one more resource into the chat here and ask that Kirsten also sent in, give me one second. send it in the follow-up email that she sends to everyone. It's like Digital Equity Act 101 kind of fact sheet. And the reason I'm sharing it is it's basically the same information that I gave you in slide format today. But if you have partners who are sort of like, I've never heard of this Digital Equity Act thing, then it's a nice kind of 101 level basic overview. And I'm going to put that here. Digital Equity Act 101 fact sheet. For folks to take a look at. And then the other publication, which I linked in the PowerPoint, but I'm going to drop in the chat again, is our recommendations around NSC's recommendations for workforce education advocates on Digital Equity Act and the planning and implementation. And there we go. Okay, so we have a couple more minutes. If anyone has any follow-up questions, happy to answer them now. I also did, my contact info is on the slides, but I'm going to put it in the chat as well in case folks want to follow up offline. Please don't be shy about bragging if you're doing some cool stuff in terms of digital skills assessments or classes, or other kinds of activities that you're already doing or that you're planning. I'd always love to hear about cool things that are going on out in the workforce and adult education fields. Kirsten, was there anything else you wanted to make sure we covered in the Q&A here? I think we've hit on a number of questions here.
Yeah, I think we're good. I just wanted to mention that this session was recorded. Amanda, I really appreciate you putting your email and your phone number in the chat and being so accessible to our attendees today. But the session was recorded, and the recording and the slide deck will be on our website, which is right here. I just put that in the chat. And then the presentation slides should already be on there. And then the recording will be on there within about 48 hours. That same link will be in your follow-up email tomorrow. So you will have access to it in your email tomorrow as well, with all that information. I'm also going to link the two resources that Amanda gave us, both that fact sheet and the NSC's recommendations on our website underneath the presentation. So that way it'll kind of be like a one-stop shop for all of you. If you want to reference back to anything that she's talked about today during this session, those things will be there along with the recording. So again, just having our website just kind of act as that one-stop shop for everyone. I also wanted to just draw attention to the follow-up survey for this session. I'm going to put that in the chat right now. If you have a minute in your workday, since we're ending the session a little early, to take that follow-up survey, we would greatly appreciate your participation. If you don't have a minute right now, if you need to jump to something else, the same link for the same follow-up survey will be in the follow-up email tomorrow as well. So that just some closing housekeeping things there. And then I just wanted to thank all of you for your participation. Thank you so much to Amanda for presenting today and giving us her wealth of information. And yeah, thank you, Amanda.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to join with all of you today.
Yeah, absolutely. So we appreciate it, and we appreciate all of you. Again, feel free to reach out to Amanda or myself if you have any questions following the session. And I'll go ahead and close this out. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your Wednesday and happy holidays.